The ballroom didn't stop. The orchestra swelled. Lyra's tray trembled as the man in gray slowly turned, and he'd seen everything. Then came the hand. The ink. The voice. "Pretend I'm your husband." The wine cellar had been a mistake. Lyra knew at the moment the service elevator groaned past the kitchen level and the doors parted to reveal something the Beaumont Hotel's architects had never intended to be seen. Not by a waitress carrying a tray of untouched canapes. Not by anyone breathing air that wasn't already thick with the kind of silence that precedes violence. 2 men. 1 chair. A third man zip-tied to it. The man in the chair had the soft, rumpled look of an academic, wire-rimmed glasses, a loosened bow tie, a pocket square that had been white an hour ago. He wasn't unconscious. That was worse. His eyes found Lyra's across the cellar, and what she saw in them wasn't a plea for rescue. It was an apology. As if he already knew what her witnessing this would cost her. She should have let the doors close. She didn't move fast enough. The taller of the 2 men turned first. Gray suit, no tie, a jaw like something quarried rather than born. His eyes swept her the way a security camera does, not with curiosity, but with the cold, mechanical efficiency of cataloging a problem. His hand didn't reach for a weapon. Not yet. He simply looked at her, and then looked at his partner, and that silent exchange was louder than anything the orchestra 4 floors above them could produce. Lyra stepped back. The elevator doors, indifferent to all of it, had already slid shut behind her. The tray went first. She didn't decide to drop it. Her fingers simply stopped believing in it. The canapes scattered across the stone floor in a soft, absurd rain, and the silver clatter rang off the vaulted ceiling like a starting pistol. She ran. Not toward the elevator. She wasn't a fool, and she wasn't about to stand waiting for the doors to decide her fate. She ran left, through the cellar arch, past the iron wine racks that blurred into a dark lattice on either side of her, through the narrow corridor that she knew, she hoped, connected to the service passage behind the kitchen. Her flats were wrong for this. They were wrong for everything about tonight, but especially for running on century-old stone with 2 men whose shoes barely made a sound. She could hear them anyway. Not their feet. Their breath. Controlled, measured, the breath of men who were not panicking, who were not even particularly hurrying, because they had done this calculation before and knew the geometry of the building better than she did. The service corridor opened into the prep kitchen through a set of double swing doors, and Lyra hit them at full speed, spilling through into the assault of white light and stainless steel and the startled faces of 3 line cooks who looked up from their stations like meerkats scenting something wrong. "Hey, you can't be back here." She didn't stop. She cut left around the central island, nearly took out a rack of dessert plates, caught it with 1 hand, and kept moving. The swing doors behind her burst open again, and she heard one of the cooks say something sharp that she couldn't parse through the blood in her ears. The kitchen was long. It had seemed manageable as a geography when the head of catering had walked her through it during the pre-event briefing. "This is your pickup station. This is the plate return. Don't use the far exit, it alarms." And she ran toward that far exit now with the specific and desperate logic of someone choosing a loud problem over a permanent one. She hit the bar across the door. The alarm screamed. Cold air. A loading bay. Concrete stairs descending to an alley that smelled of old cooking fat and city rain, still damp from an afternoon shower. She took the stairs in 3s and landed hard on the alley floor, 1 ankle folding just slightly, not enough to stop her, enough to remind her she was still a person made of bone and consequence. The alley opened left to a street bright with taxis and the indifferent noise of a Friday night. She went right because right was darker, and dark had started to feel like the only honest offer the night was making. She was fast. She'd always been fast, not athlete fast, but waitress fast, the specific, honed efficiency of a person who had spent 6 years threading through crowded rooms with both hands full and nowhere to put her mistakes. She moved with her body close to the wall, through the gap between a delivery truck and a row of recycling containers, and she thought briefly, stupidly, that she might actually have lost them. Then she heard the door at the top of the loading bay stairs open with the quiet authority of something well-oiled and patient. One set of footsteps. Just one. Which meant the other was already somewhere she couldn't see. Her lungs were burning. Her ankle was singing. The alley terminated 20 meters ahead in a wrought iron gate, and beyond it, blurred through the iron bars and the adrenaline narrowing her vision, she could see the amberlit colonnade of the Beaumont's main entrance, the valets. The guests still arriving in black cars, the entire chandelier and champagne architecture of an event that had no idea what was happening beneath its feet. She grabbed the gate. Locked. The footsteps behind her didn't rush. They didn't need to. She spun, back against the iron bars, and in the shadows of the alley she could see the shape of him, gray suit, that quarried jaw, hands loose at his sides. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already put a number next to. "You should have stayed in the elevator," he said. Not unkindly. That was the most frightening thing about it. Lyra's hand tightened on the gate. Her mind ran the exits the way it ran a busy floor section, fast, automatic, without sentiment. The gate. The wall. The door she'd come from. The man in front of her. And then the alley's side entrance, a narrow slot between buildings she hadn't registered until this exact second, maybe 2 meters to her left. She went for it. She didn't know what was on the other side. She didn't need to. She needed it to not be this. The slot opened into a courtyard, deliveries, dumpsters, a single bare bulb above a staff entrance, and she burst through it and collided, hard, with a wall of dark fabric and solid mass and the faint, jarring scent of expensive bourbon and something colder beneath it. Hands caught her before she hit the ground. Both of them. Not grabbing, steadying. Which was somehow worse. She looked up. The man was tall. Dark suit, no tie. A neck tattoo that coiled upward like a signature. Eyes the color of gunmetal that looked at her not with the cold catalog of the man in the alley, but with something more dangerous than that. Recognition. Like he'd been waiting for her to come through that exact gap in exactly that state of ruin, and was entirely unsurprised to find her there. "Lyra Belen," he said quietly. Not a question. She hadn't told anyone her name tonight. He didn't let go. That was the first thing she cataloged, not his face, not the tattoo, not the fact that he'd said her name like it had been sitting in his mouth all evening waiting for the right moment to surface. Just the hands. Firm around her forearms, not crushing, not gentle, occupying that precise middle register that communicated a single clear message. "You are not going anywhere until I decide you are. Get off me. There are 2 men between you and the street." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had the quality of something that had never needed volume to be obeyed. One came through the loading bay. The other is already at the colonnade entrance. "You ran into a box, Lyra. I'm the only door left in it." She heard the alley behind her. The footsteps had slowed, the measured, unhurried pace of someone who had stopped needing to hurry. "Who are you?" Not a question. She didn't have the breath for question marks. "Someone who intercepted a list with your name on it." He released one of her arms and reached into the interior of his jacket with a movement so controlled it managed to be both fast and unthreatening. What he produced was not a weapon. It was a folded document, thick cream paper, the kind that came with seals and ceremony. He pressed it into her free hand. "Your father's name is on the other side. I'll explain everything, but not here, and not in the next 30 seconds, which is approximately how long we have before Davin comes through that slot, and this becomes a different kind of conversation." Lyra looked at the paper. She didn't open it. There wasn't time to process it, and there was something about opening it, about accepting the reality it presumably contained, that felt like a door she couldn't unwalk through. "What do you want me to do?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. She wouldn't have trusted softness. Something more like assessment, recalibrated upward. Like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked yet. There's a checkpoint at the East Corridor. Two of Vargas's people running it under the pretense of event security. They have a photo of you and instructions to hold anyone matching it. He straightened his jacket with one precise motion and held out his arm, not a grab this time, an offer, the kind a man makes when he's escorting someone into a room full of people who are watching. You're going to take my arm. You're going to walk like you're annoyed at me, specifically, and not afraid of anything else in the world. You've been looking for me for the last 20 minutes because I promised you one dance and spent the whole time at the bar. That's specific. Yes, specificity is what sells it. His eyes moved briefly to the slot behind her, then back. They're looking for a waitress who ran. They are not looking for Zenith Cross's wife, who is furious about being ignored at a gala she didn't want to attend. A pause, measured, deliberate. My name is Zen. When you use it, say it like it costs you something. She almost laughed. It came out as something stranger, not quite sound, not quite air, the involuntary release of a person whose nervous system had simply run out of appropriate responses. She took his arm. His forearm was solid under her hand, the fabric of his jacket expensive and dark, and she felt through it the particular stillness of a person who had trained themselves to project calm as a tactical instrument. She matched her stride to his as they moved back through the courtyard, through a side door he'd apparently already propped open, and into the carpeted hush of the Beaumont's East Service corridor. The transition from concrete and cold air to warm amber lighting and muffled orchestral strings was so abrupt it felt physiological. Her breathing tried to normalize. She didn't let it do it too quickly. Ahead, where the service corridor joined the main hall, two men stood in the deliberate non-posture of private security, formally dressed, earpieces barely visible, hands clasped in front of them. One held a tablet. Even from 15 meters she could see it was open to something. An image. She didn't need to see the resolution to know what it was. She felt Zen's arm shift slightly beneath her hand, not a flinch, an adjustment, the way a musician adjusts their grip before a difficult passage. She thought about what he'd said. Say it like it costs you something. She let her jaw set. Let the fear she was already carrying reshape itself, the way fear sometimes can when it's given a container, not gone, just redirected, poured into something with a different shape. She thought about every table she'd ever worked where the couple arrived already fighting. She knew what that looked like. She knew it in her body. You said one dance, she said. Loud enough. Voice carrying the particular clipped edge of a woman who has been patient past the point of grace. 1. I've been standing near the Hartley table for 40 minutes looking like I arrived alone, which, for the record, is exactly what I told you would happen if you started the evening at the bar. Lyra. His voice was a low warning that contained, she had to admit, an impressive simulation of a man who had heard this before and was bracing for the duration of it. Don't Lyra me in that tone. They were at the checkpoint. The guard with the tablet looked up. His eyes moved across her face with that same cataloging quality as the man in the cellar, and she felt it, the half-second of comparison, image against reality, and she held his gaze with the specific, distracted impatience of someone whose attention was mostly still on the argument. Zen produced something from his jacket pocket without being asked, a card, dark, no visible text from her angle, and extended it with the bored fluency of a man who had passed checkpoints like this so many times the gesture had become muscle memory. The guard looked at the card. Something in his posture changed. Not deference, exactly. Something quieter and more absolute than deference. He stepped aside. They walked through. She didn't exhale. Not yet. She counted the steps 5, 8, 12 until the checkpoint was behind them and the corridor opened into the pre-function room, populated with guests in clusters, string quartet in the corner, the whole warm, oblivious machinery of privilege doing what it did best. You're good at that, Zen said quietly. Not a compliment. An observation, delivered with the precision of someone filing information. I've been performing for difficult rooms my whole life, she said. I just usually get tipped for it. She felt the almost movement at his jaw. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The card, she said. The checkpoint. They were his people and they let us through. The Varkas Syndicate runs security for events like this as a revenue stream. But Cross Money built this hotel's east wing. He steered her gently left, toward the quieter edge of the room. Even predators respect architecture. And the list. She kept her voice level. With my name on it. And my father's. He looked at her then, fully, for the first time since the courtyard, and what she found in his expression was not the cold catalogue of the men hunting her, nor the warm performance of a man playing husband. It was something that looked, uncomfortably, like grief. Yes, he said. We need to talk about your father. The ballroom was the worst possible place to have a crisis. Lyra understood this the moment Zen steered her through the gilded archway, and the full spectacle of it hit her. 300 people arranged in the specific geometry of wealth on display. The chandelier throwing its light across the room like it was auditioning for something, the orchestra occupying a raised platform at the far end with the serene authority of people who would keep playing regardless of what happened beneath them. It was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, completely, deliberately, and without any concern for the people standing inside it. She tightened her hand on Zen's arm. Smile, he said. Not looking at her. Not happy. Tolerating. She knew the smile he meant. She'd worn it 100 times on 100 difficult shifts, the expression of a woman who has made her peace with the evening not going the way she planned, who is present and composed and very slightly above it all. She arranged her face into it now and felt it settle like a mask that fit too well. They moved into the room. The first thing she noticed was how people looked at him. Not stared. The caliber of guest in a room like this had long since trained themselves out of obvious staring, but tracked. The way a room tracks something that has mass, gravitational pull, the quality of an object around which other objects quietly reorient. Conversations didn't stop as Zen passed through them. They just tilted. Eyes followed without heads turning. Hands stilled on champagne flutes for a half-second before remembering themselves. She understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with the wine she hadn't drunk, that this man was not merely powerful. He was the kind of powerful that other powerful people measured themselves against. And she was supposed to be annoyed at him. She let the observation sharpen itself into something usable. Let it become specific. Because she understood, in the bones of her, in the 6 years of reading tables and rooms, and the precise emotional weather of people who held all the cards, that the most convincing performance was never the one you manufactured from nothing. It was the one you built from something true. She was terrified. She was exhausted. She had been running for 20 minutes and before that had watched a man with kind eyes and a ruined pocket square look at her like an apology. She had a folded document in her hand that she hadn't opened because she wasn't ready for what it contained. And she was walking through a room full of people, some of whom wanted her dead, on the arm of a man who knew her name before she gave it to him. She was, genuinely and completely, not where she wanted to be. That was the wife. You didn't tell me Harlan Voss would be here, she said. Quiet, conversational, the specific murmur of a woman speaking to her husband and not to the room. She had no idea who Harlan Voss was. The name had surfaced from some half-remembered fragment of overheard conversation during setup, one of the event coordinator's anxious name drops while arranging the table placements. It was the right kind of name for a room like this. A barely perceptible pause in Zen's stride. Recovering. Good. I didn't think it would matter to you, he said. It matters to me because last time I had to stand next to that man for 40 minutes while he explained his wine cellar to me, and I'd like to be emotionally prepared. She plucked a glass of champagne from a passing tray, a real one, carried by a real waitress who didn't look at her, and the cognitive dissonance of that was something she tucked away to examine never, and took a sip that she didn't taste. Is that too much to ask? A small amount of preparation. I'll keep him away from you. You'll try. She let the word carry the weight of established marital history. They passed a cluster of older men near the center of the room, 3 of them arranged in the loose triangle of a conversation that had been going on long enough to become comfortable. One of them caught Zen's eye and gave a nod, not warm, not cold, the precise nod of one sovereign acknowledging another across a shared border. Zen returned it with the same economy. Lyra looked slightly away, as though mildly bored by her husband's professional obligations, and used the angle to scan the room the way she'd been scanning rooms for years, not for exits this time, but for gray suits. She counted 4. 2 near the main entrance, 1 by the bar, 1 stationed at an interior door that she suspected led back toward the east corridor they'd just come from. All 4 had done what the checkpoint guard had done, that same almost imperceptible recalibration when their eyes found Zen and the woman on his arm. None of them were looking for a wife. They were still looking for a waitress. The costume was the performance. The performance was the costume. "The woman in blue at the second table," she said, keeping her voice at the same mild, domestic register. "She's been watching you since we came in, and she's not doing the polite thing about it." Maren Voss. Harlan's daughter. "We have history." "Of course you do." She let a breath out through her nose, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, the specific exhalation of a woman who has long since stopped being surprised. "Is there anyone in this room you don't have history with?" "You." She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. She kept her expression exactly where it was, slightly aggrieved, slightly elevated, the tolerating smile, because she was in the middle of the room and the room was still watching, and what she felt was hers, not the performance's. She filed it under things she would think about later, in whatever later looked like, if later existed. They reached the far edge of the ballroom near the orchestra, where the density of guests thinned and the music was loud enough to provide genuine cover. Zen guided her to a position near one of the stone columns, facing the room, his back to the wall, and she understood instinctively that this was not a choice he'd made just now. He always stood with his back to something solid. "There are 4 of Varkas's people visible," she said quietly. 5. The woman near the coat check is also one of his. She hadn't clocked the coat check. She noted the gap. "You did well," he said. Same tone as before, observation, not warmth. But something in the precision of it felt more substantial than most warmth she'd received. "I told you." Difficult rooms. She took another sip of champagne she couldn't taste and watched the woman in blue stop, pretending not to look. "How long do we need to stay in here?" "Until Carver signals from the east exit that the car is positioned." He didn't look at his watch. He didn't need to. 12 minutes. Maybe 15. 12 minutes in the lion's den, wearing a borrowed life, on the arm of a man whose history she didn't know, with her father's name folded in her hand like an unexploded thing. The orchestra swelled into something lush and slow, and several couples moved toward the floor. "We should dance," Zen said. She looked at him. "You promised me one," she said. "Remember." And they walked out onto the floor together, into the light, into the open, the most visible and therefore the safest place in the room. 2 people performing a marriage in the middle of a ballroom full of people who would have killed one of them an hour ago. The orchestra played on. They found a room that wasn't on the event floor plan. Zen knew where it was without looking for it, which told her everything about the kind of man who moved through the world by first memorizing its hidden architecture. A service anteroom off the east corridor, small enough that the 2 of them made it feel smaller, furnished with nothing but a folding table, a stack of linen, and a single wall sconce that threw more shadow than light. He closed the door behind them with the quiet finality of someone who had learned that loudness was for people who hadn't yet understood their own authority. The dance had lasted 9 minutes. Long enough to satisfy the room. Long enough for Carver, a compact, watchful man she'd been introduced to by a nod and a single word, to appear at the edge of the floor and deliver something to Zen's jacket pocket with the sleight of hand of someone who had practiced invisible transactions his entire adult life. The car was 12 minutes out, which meant she had 12 minutes to understand what was in her hand. She unfolded the document. It was a single sheet, the cream paper dense with the specific formatting of a legal instrument, columns, reference numbers, a watermark she didn't recognize. But below the formal architecture of it, Near the bottom, in a section that had been highlighted with a single clean stroke of yellow, was a name. Marco Belen. Outstanding. Transferred, Cross Holdings. She stared at it. My father has been dead for 4 years, she said. I know. He was an electrician. He rewired commercial kitchens for a living. She looked up from the paper. He didn't have the kind of life that produces documents like this. Zen leaned against the folding table with the particular stillness of a man who has rehearsed a conversation but is choosing, in the moment, to let it breathe rather than perform it. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the courtyard, that expression she'd filed under grief and not yet retrieved, and he said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Then he began. Her father had not always been an electrician. Before Lyra was born, before her mother, before the small house in Carver's Hill with the kitchen garden and the second-hand bookshelves, Marco Belen had been something else entirely. Not criminal. Zen was precise about this distinction in a way that suggested it mattered to him. Not criminal, but adjacent. The kind of adjacent that happens when a young man with a specific technical skill set is introduced to people who have uses for it, and the money they offer is the kind that reorders a person's idea of what's possible. He had worked for a man named Aldrich Varkas. Not the son, Cale Varkas, who ran the syndicate now with the particular viciousness of someone who had inherited power rather than built it, but the father. Aldrich, who had been, by all accounts, a more controlled predator. Marco had done electrical work. Legitimate electrical work, mostly. But the buildings he'd wired had sometimes contained rooms that weren't on any permit, and the equipment in those rooms had run on power that Marco had routed with care and silence, and the professional satisfaction of a man who was very good at his job. He had stopped when Lyra's mother became pregnant. Not gradually. Completely. One day, and then never again. Aldrich Varkas had not charged him for the exit. That was the nature of the debt, not money owed, but favor held. An open account with no stated terms, which was, Zen explained quietly, the most dangerous kind. Because the terms got set by the creditor, at a time of the creditor's choosing, and Marco Belen had spent 23 years waiting to find out what he owed. He never found out. He died first, a cardiac event, genuine and unglamorous, in the parking lot of the restaurant he'd been rewiring. Natural causes confirmed. Zen was careful to confirm it. But debts don't die with debtors. Not in the world Aldrich Varkas built. They transfer. To the estate, to the family, to whoever can be made to represent the outstanding balance. And when Aldrich died 3 years ago and Cale inherited both the empire and its ledger, he had gone through his father's open accounts with the specific appetite of a man who wanted to close them all and start clean with his own cruelties. Marco Belen's account had transferred to Lyra. He didn't know what he had, Zen said. Your father. The rooms he wired, he was meticulous. He documented everything. Measurements, schematics, equipment specifications. The professional habit of a man who took his work seriously. A pause. Some of those schematics document infrastructure that the Varkas syndicate has been operating for 15 years. Infrastructure that, in the wrong hands, constitutes evidence sufficient to end Cale Varkas's operation permanently. Lyra was very still. He kept records, she said. In a storage unit in your name. Transferred to you in his will as personal effects. He may not have understood what he had. But he understood enough to make sure it went to you and not to anyone who might come looking. She thought about the storage unit. Unit 14, Carver's Hill Self-Storage, the key on a ring with a ceramic sunflower tag that she'd kept in her kitchen drawer for 4 years because she hadn't been able to make herself go through his things and hadn't been able to throw the key away either. She had driven past the facility twice. She had never gone in. Cale Varkas found out about the unit 8 weeks ago, Zen continued. He put your name on an open contract. Not yet activated, he wanted the contents first, then the witness. He looked at her steadily. I intercepted the contract through a channel I maintain inside his organization. That is how I knew your name. That is why I was at this gala tonight. Kale was expected to make a move toward you here, and I wanted to be in position when he did. You wanted the schematics, she said. Yes. She appreciated the absence of performance in the admission. He didn't dress it in altruism. He needed something from her father's ghost, and he was telling her so directly, and she filed that as the most trustworthy thing he had done since the courtyard. And the man in the wine cellar, she said. The man in the chair. Something moved briefly behind his eyes. A broker who was attempting to sell Kale a copy of those schematics that he didn't actually have. Kale does not respond well to that kind of optimism. She looked down at the document in her hands again. Her father's name in a highlighted column, patient and permanent. Marco Belen, who had grown kitchen gardens and rewired commercial kitchens and kept his past in a storage unit under a ceramic sunflower key, had carried this for 23 years without ever letting her see the weight of it. She folded the document carefully along its original creases. The storage unit, she said. If I give you access to it, you become a loose end for Varkas regardless of whether I have the schematics or not. He said it without softening it. I know. Which is why access to the unit is not the transaction I'm proposing. She looked up. Then what are you proposing? He reached into his jacket and produced Carver's delivery, a single key card, hotel branded, a room number written on the paper sleeve in precise handwriting. Tonight, you disappear. Tomorrow, we talk about what comes next. He held it out. 12 minutes is almost up, Lyra. She took the key. Her father's debt. Her father's secret. Her father's careful, quiet insurance policy left in the hands of the one person he'd trusted most without ever explaining why she might need it. She thought she finally understood the apology in the bound man's eyes. It hadn't been for himself. The plan changed the way plans always changed, without warning and at the worst possible moment. Carver appeared in the anteroom doorway with the specific economy of motion that Lyra had already learned to read as bad news delivered efficiently. He said 3 words to Zen in a language she didn't recognize, and Zen's expression didn't shift, but something behind it did, a recalibration so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent the last hour learning to read him. The east exit is compromised, Zen said. Meaning Varkas moved faster than anticipated, and there are now 3 of his people between us and the car. He looked at Carver, who produced a small folded card and held it without extending it. There is another way out. A private exit through the hotel's gaming room, used by the ownership for guests who require discretion. It requires a physical key held by the room's host for the evening. Who is the host? Zen took the card from Carver and held it out to her. She looked at it. A name, embossed in the hotel's formal typeface. Rennick Vale. Private gaming. Level B. She didn't know the name, but she knew the way Zen held the card at a slight distance, as though it was something that required handling rather than simply holding. Rennick Vale is Kale Varkaza's financial architect, Zen said. He structures the syndicate's capital flows. He is also the most perceptive man in this building, which is why Kale keeps him managing money instead of people. He's too valuable to risk in the field. A pause. He will have seen the photo. And he will test anything that doesn't feel completely right. But he'll have the exit key. He hosts the private table every event. The exit key is how ownership ensures his guests can leave without being observed. He carries it as a matter of course. Zen's eyes were steady on hers. If I approach that table alone, Rennick will know immediately that something is in motion. He knows I don't play cards for recreation. But if I arrive with my wife, annoyed about the evening, wanting somewhere quieter to finish a drink, we walk in as cover and walk out with a key. If our performance holds. She thought about the ballroom. The checkpoint. The 9 minutes on the dance floor under the chandeliers in different light. She thought about the tolerating smile and how well it had fit. What does Rennick Vale look like, she said. Zen told her. Level B had a different atmosphere entirely, the deliberate hush of a room designed to make large sums of money feel like a quiet, personal matter. Dark walls, low lighting, 4 tables occupied by the specific subspecies of wealthy that preferred their entertainment without an audience. A bar along one wall, a single bartender who moved with the discretion of a confessor. The carpet was thick enough to absorb not just sound but consequence. Rennick Vale was exactly what Zen had described. Slight, silver-haired, somewhere between 60 and ageless, dressed with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He sat at the center table with 3 other players and the unhurried posture of someone who had already done the most important work of the evening before he sat down. He looked up when they entered. His eyes found Lyra first. That was the tell, not Zen, not the money, not the room. Her. The variable. She let it land and looked away, toward the bar, with the mild impatience of a woman who has been steered somewhere she didn't choose. 20 minutes, she said to Zen. Pitched perfectly, not loud enough for the room, but not private either. The specific volume of a conversation that isn't meant to be overheard, but isn't particularly guarded against it. 20 minutes, and then I want to go back upstairs. We'll have a drink. He guided her toward the bar with a hand at the small of her back, and she felt through the fabric of her jacket how carefully calibrated the pressure was, present enough to be observed, light enough to be read as habitual rather than performed. They ordered Zen's bourbon. Something sparkling for her that she chose because it gave her a glass to hold and a reason to look around the room with the incurious gaze of a woman assessing her surroundings for comfort rather than exits. Rennick Vale was still looking at her. Not overtly. In the way that very intelligent people look at things, peripherally, briefly, repeatedly. Building a picture from fragments so that the picture feels arrived at rather than constructed. It was Zen who made the approach, which was right. It would have been strange for him not to acknowledge a man of Vale's standing in a room this small. He crossed to the table with Lyra's hand in the crook of his arm, and the exchange was brief, formal, the greeting of 2 men who occupied the same world from different coordinates. Cross. Rennick's voice was light, precise, the voice of a man who had learned that tone was a form of leverage. His eyes moved to Lyra. I wasn't aware you'd brought company this evening. She prefers to be called a wife, Zen said. Rennick looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile. Is that what you prefer? I prefer a quiet evening, Lyra said pleasantly. Which has not been forthcoming. A beat. Rennick's attention moved across her face with that same peripheral efficiency, and she felt him doing what the checkpoint guard had done: comparison, image against reality, but more sophisticated, more patient, looking not just at the surface, but at the seams. Looking for the join between what was presented and what was true. She held his gaze with the mild, untroubled expression of a woman whose life was exactly what it appeared to be. You play? Rennick asked her. Badly, she said. My husband plays well enough for both of us, which he will tell you himself if you give him an opening. Something shifted at the table. One of the other players, heavy-set, watch too large for his wrist, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Rennick's almost smile moved a fraction. Sit, he said. One hand. I find it clarifying to play with new people. She understood immediately. This was not hospitality. This was examination. Rennick Vale wanted them at the table where he could read them at close range, where the controlled environment of the game would create pressure, and pressure created cracks, and cracks were where the truth lived. She sat down. The cards were dealt. Lyra looked at hers and understood them, not because she played, but because a decade of reading tables had taught her to read faces, and reading faces across a poker table was simply a more concentrated version of the same skill. She knew within 30 seconds what the heavy-set man was holding. She suspected the woman to her left was bluffing. She was less certain about Rennick, which told her that Rennick was very good. What she focused on was the performance. She complained once about the room being too warm. She reached across and adjusted Zen's cufflink with the absent, proprietary intimacy of a woman who had been doing it for years, the gesture of someone for whom another person's appearance has become an extension of her own domain. She lost her first hand with convincing indifference. She let her knee rest against Zen's beneath the table and felt him absorb the contact without reaction, steady, present, utterly controlled. Rennick won the second hand and collected the chips without looking at them. "How long have you been married?" he asked, conversationally, eyes on the new deal. "Long enough," Lyra said. At exactly the same moment Zen said, 3 years. The table went quiet. Not silent. The room still held its ambient hush, the soft machinery of cards and crystal, but the specific quiet of people registering a discrepancy. Lyra picked up her glass. Let a breath out through her nose, that same exhalation from the ballroom, the one that carried the weight of a long marriage's private arithmetic. "He counts from the wedding," she said. "I count from when it actually started." She looked at Zen with the expression of a woman delivering a truth he already knew and was mildly tired of having confirmed. "We have a disagreement about which date is real." Rennick looked at Zen. Zen looked at Lyra with something that was not entirely performance. "She's not wrong," he said. Rennick set his cards face down, reached into his jacket pocket, produced a key small, flat, hotel-branded, and set it on the table between them with the deliberate placement of a man making a considered decision. "The private exit is through the door behind the bar," he said quietly. "It opens to the parking structure. I find it useful when guests need to leave without ceremony." His eyes moved between them once more, and what lived in them was not warmth, but something that might have been, in another life, its cousin. "I hope the rest of your evening is quieter." Zen palmed the key in a single motion. They were at the door behind the bar in under a minute. Lyra's hands were perfectly steady. She noticed this with the detached interest of someone observing a surprising fact about a stranger. She had just outplayed a man who structured criminal capital flows, using nothing but the logic of a long marriage she didn't have, and her hands were steady. "The date disagreement," Zen said quietly, as they moved through the door into the concrete cool of the parking structure. "That was good." "I know," she said. And she didn't look back. The safe house lasted 4 hours. It was a clean room on the 11th floor of a building that didn't advertise itself, no hotel branding, no lobby to speak of, a keypad entry and a stairwell that smelled of concrete and discretion. Carver had brought a change of clothes for her, practical and anonymous, dark jeans and a jacket with deep pockets that she appreciated without asking how he'd known her size. She'd slept for 2 hours in a chair by the window, not because it was comfortable, but because her body had simply stopped negotiating and taken what was available. Zen hadn't slept. She knew this without seeing it. He'd been positioned at the small table when she closed her eyes, and he was positioned there still when she opened them, the city's pre-dawn gray beginning to dilute the dark beyond the glass. His phone face down and his hands still in the particular way she was learning meant he was not resting, but processing. She didn't ask what he was processing. She was doing her own. The safe house in the underbelly was a former print shop. She knew it from the smell, ink and paper memory embedded so deeply in the walls that no amount of time had fully evicted it. The front had been stripped and repurposed, the plate glass windows replaced with solid panels, the signage gone, but the bones of the place still held their original occupation the way bones always do. There were 3 rooms. A main space with a work table and 2 chairs. A back room with a cot, a sink, and a first aid kit that she cataloged automatically because she had spent enough years in commercial kitchens to catalog anything mounted to a wall. And a 3rd room, door closed, where Carver went immediately and didn't come back from. Zen sat at the work table. The key from Rennick's table sat between them. Beside it, her father's document, refolded along its original creases. And beside that, the ceramic sunflower key she'd retrieved from the lining of her jacket. She'd transferred it there weeks ago without knowing why, the kind of domestic instinct that turns out to be something else entirely. They were finally going to have the conversation. Except the door opened first. Not Carver's door. The front door, the solid paneled one that had been locked, that she had heard Carver lock behind them, that now swung inward with the specific controlled speed of something breached rather than opened. One man, then two, and behind them the gray suit architecture of the Varkas Syndicate at operational tempo, and Lyra's body was already moving before her mind had fully processed the geometry of it. She went left, toward the back room, toward the first aid kit and the sink and the wall-mounted fire extinguisher she had also cataloged because she couldn't help cataloging things. She heard Zen behind her, not retreating, never retreating, the sharp, compressed sounds of a confrontation that was not equal and didn't need to be, because Zen moved through violence with the same terrifying economy he moved through everything else. Then a sound she had not heard before. Close, flat, decisive. The kind of sound that rewrites the room it occurs in. And Zen came through the back room door behind her and closed it, and his left hand was pressed to his right side, and between his fingers she could see something dark and immediate that was not ink and was not shadow. He looked at her. The extinguisher, he said. Wedge it under the handle. She was already doing it. The worktable scraped in the main room. Something heavy. Carver, handling the situation with his customary invisible efficiency, she could hear it without seeing it, the specific audio grammar of a contained space being vigorously renegotiated. A minute of it. Then quiet. Then Carver's to knock on the door, and she moved the extinguisher, and he came through with a cut above his eye that he had already decided not to mention, and a look that confirmed the main room was theirs again. "Car in 4 minutes," he said, and looked at Zen's hand, and something moved across his face that was gone before it could be named. "I need 3, Lyra said. Both men looked at her. She was already at the first aid kit. She had never performed field surgery. She wanted to be precise about this. She held no illusions about her qualifications, no cinematic confidence in skills she didn't have. What she had was something more specific and, in this moment, more useful. She had 11 years of managing chaos with both hands full. She had the particular nervous system of a person who had worked double shifts in understaffed kitchens and gala service floors, and every variety of controlled emergency that civilian life produces, and who had learned that the difference between someone who managed and someone who didn't was not skill so much as the ability to trio, sequence, and execute without waiting for the fear to finish its speech. She had that. "Sit," she said. Zen sat. The controlled stillness was still there, but it had a different quality now, maintained rather than natural, the stillness of a man applying will to something his body wanted to contest. He moved his hand from his side, and she looked at what was there with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to a ticket rail at full service. Entry wound. No exit. The bullet had done what bullets do when they don't do the worst thing. She'd seen kitchen injuries that looked more dramatic and were less serious. She'd seen kitchen injuries that looked less dramatic and were considerably worse. This one she assessed in the time it took her to open the kit, serious, manageable, requiring compression, cleaning, and a dressing that would hold until something better was available. She could do that. "This will hurt," she said. "I'm aware of how this works," Zen said. "I'm not warning you for your benefit," she said, pulling on the single pair of gloves in the kit with the practiced snap of someone who had put on kitchen gloves approximately 10,000 times. "I'm telling you so you don't move." She cleaned the wound. He didn't move. She had worked with line cooks who screamed when they burned their hands on a sauté pan, and she had worked with line cooks who cut themselves to the bone and kept plating, and she had always respected the second kind and understood, now, which category Zen occupied. She packed the wound with the gauze from the kit, applied pressure with the flat, efficient competence of someone who had pressed towels to kitchen accidents while simultaneously calling out order completions because the tickets didn't stop for bleeding. She felt his breathing through her hands, controlled, deliberate, the respiratory discipline of a man who had decided that pain was information rather than experience. "Your father," Zen said, while she worked. His voice was level. She didn't know how. "Don't," she said. "I need to tell you something. You need to stay still." "Lyra." She taped the dressing. Applied the secondary layer. Checked the edges. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at him, this man who had said her name in a courtyard like he'd been carrying it, who had walked her through a ballroom and a poker table and the city's underbelly with his back always to something solid, and she waited. I wasn't only intercepting a contract, he said. Your father, in the last year of his life, he made contact through a channel I maintain. He knew what the storage unit contained. He knew Cale would eventually find it. A pause. The controlled breathing. He asked me to make sure it reached someone who would use it correctly. And to make sure you were not in the room when it did. She was very still. He knew you, she said. He knew of me. He did his research. Something moved in Zen's expression, that grief again, surfacing and then resubmerging, but slower this time. He was a careful man, your father. He spent 23 years being careful. At the end, he decided that careful wasn't sufficient anymore. He needed someone with a specific capacity to make Cale Varka stop. Zen looked at his hands. He also said, and I want to be precise about this, that whoever he trusted with the documents would need to be someone who would treat his daughter as a person rather than a transaction. The print shop held its ink memory silence. Lyra looked at the dressing she'd applied. Clean, secure, correctly pressured. The work of someone who'd learned that every surface emergency had a sequence if you were willing to find it. He vetted you, she said. For me. He left you a list of names in the storage unit. People he trusted, people he didn't, and one name circled. Zen met her eyes. He was a better judge of character than most people I've paid significantly more for the service. Outside, Carver's car arrived. She could hear the engine. 2 minutes, maybe less. She pulled off the gloves. Her hands were steady. They had been steady through all of it, the cleaning, the packing, the taping, and she looked at them now in the dim print shop light and thought about her father in a parking lot, a cardiac event, natural and unglamorous, and whether in the last clear moment of his careful life he had understood that the thing he'd spent 23 years protecting was not a secret. It was her. Can you walk, she said. Yes. She stood. Offered her hand. Not performance this time. No ballroom, no checkpoint, no poker table requiring a specific chemistry. Just a hand extended in a room that smelled of old ink and new consequence. He took it. And she felt, through the grip, the particular quality of something that had stopped being a transaction and become, without either of them formally deciding it, something that didn't have a cleaner name than what it was. Carver knocked once. The door opened. The city waited. They walked out together. Had happened in the coat closet, 6 minutes of enforced stillness, while Varka's sweep team passed through the corridor outside, Zen's hand at her shoulder keeping her back against the wall. Both of them breathing shallowly in the dark among the heavy coats of people who had no idea their garments were witnessing something. He had told her, in a voice so low it was barely architecture, about the weight of the name Cross. What it had cost to build it. What it cost to keep it. She hadn't said anything, because there was nothing to say that the darkness wasn't already holding, and because something in the quality of his telling, stripped of the control he wore everywhere else, worn down to something that was just true, had made her understand that the debt and the ledger and the schematics were not actually what this was about. He had intercepted her father's contract because Marco Bellin's name had appeared in a file that also contained the name of someone Zen had lost. He hadn't told her who. She hadn't pushed. Some doors announced themselves. It began at 4:47 in the morning when Carver knocked twice, opened the door without waiting, and said, simply, "We're burned." Zen was on his feet before the second word. How? Rennick. He made her after we left, pulled the waitstaff manifest, ran it against event registration. Carver's eyes moved briefly to Lyra. Not accusatory. Informational. Vale gave Cale the room number 40 minutes ago. There's a team in the building. The building. Not on their floor. Not at the door. In the building, which was its own kind of urgency, not the sharp spike of immediate danger, but the specific, nauseating pressure of a closing perimeter. Zen looked at Lyra once. Can you run? She was already putting on the jacket. The stairwell was the right answer and the wrong answer simultaneously. Right because the elevator was an obvious kill box. Wrong because a stairwell offered only two directions and Vargas's people would know that too. Zen made the decision in the time it took Carver to check the corridor, and the decision was down, which meant toward them rather than away, and she understood the logic. The unexpected vector was the one that bought time. They went down 7 floors at a controlled run. Not full speed in a stairwell was how ankles broke and advantages were surrendered. She kept her hand on the railing and counted landings and listened. On the 6th floor, she heard a door open above them and the specific compressed cadence of people moving with purpose, and Zen's hand found her arm, and they pushed through the 5th floor door into a corridor before the sound could resolve into something worse. The 5th floor was residential. Long and quiet, the muffled anonymity of a building full of people sleeping through events that didn't concern them. They moved fast and low, and Carver peeled off at the far end without a word, gone through a door that she suspected he'd identified on his way in because Carver appeared to be a man who always identified the door on his way in. Zen pulled her into an alcove near the ice machine as footsteps found the corridor behind them. 2 sets. Moving systematically, checking doors. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at Zen in the dim service lighting, and he looked back at her with the absolute, unnerving calm of a man whose fear had been converted so completely into function that it no longer registered as fear at all. He held up 2 fingers. She nodded. Then he tilted his head toward the window at the end of the alcove, a narrow casement, the kind that opened onto a fire escape, latched from the inside. She looked at it. She looked at him. She unlatched the window. The fire escape was cold and immediate, the city air hitting her like a correction after the pressurized warmth of the building. For stories of iron stairs descending to an alley, she recognized the shape of parallel to the parking structure, which meant Carver's contingency car was potentially accessible from the alley's north end if Carver had done what she suspected Carver always did. She went down fast this time. Full speed. The ankle remembered the cellar stairs and complained briefly, and she told it to be quiet. They hit the alley at ground level and Zen moved immediately. Not running attracted eyes, but the long, ground-covering stride of someone with somewhere to be, and she matched it. And they were 30 meters into the alley before the window above them opened and a voice said something flat and radio-directed that told her the 5th floor was no longer their problem because the 5th floor already knew they were gone. The car was there. Carver, by some geometry she couldn't fully account for, was already in the driver's seat. She got in. The city absorbed them the way cities absorb things at 4 a.m., without ceremony, without record, the nighttime infrastructure of a place that had always understood that some of its traffic was not for daylight. Carver drove without urgency, which was its own form of urgency, the practiced patience of a man who knew that speed was conspicuous and invisibility was the actual destination. Lyra watched the Beaumont disappear in the side mirror. The chandelier glow of it, faint through the pre-dawn gray, and then a turn, and then nothing. Rennick made me from the waitstaff manifest, she said. Yes. Which means he was never entirely convinced at the table. He was convinced enough to give us the keys, Anne said. He gave us the key. She turned that over. Rennick Vale, Cale Vargas's financial architect, the most perceptive man in the building, had looked at them across a poker table and made a decision. He'd given them the exit key and waited 40 minutes before making the call. Why did he wait? She said. Zen looked out the window at the city moving past. Rennick Vale worked with my father before he worked with Aldrich Vargas, he said. There are people in this world who are loyal to what they came from, even when they serve what they've become. A pause, measured and precise. He gave us 40 minutes because it was the most he could give without it costing him everything. She absorbed that. The texture of it, the way people could be simultaneously complicit and humane, serving one thing while quietly, at great personal cost, honoring another. Like an electrician who wired rooms he shouldn't have and spent 23 years making sure his daughter would never need to know about it. Carver turned onto a road she didn't recognize, heading south, into the part of the city that didn't appear on the tourist maps. Lower buildings. Different light. The kind of neighborhood that operated on its own understanding of the rules. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere they won't look," Zen said. "Somewhere we can finish the conversation we started." She thought about the storage unit. The ceramic sunflower key. Her father's careful, patient documentation of rooms that weren't on any permit, sitting in Unit 14 in her name like an inheritance she'd never known she was holding. "The conversation about what comes next," she said. "Yes." Outside the window, the city's underbelly spread out in both directions, unglamorous and functional and utterly indifferent to the specific nature of the people moving through it. Just another car. Just another set of people the night was quietly relocating from one version of their life to another. She pressed her back into the seat and let the motion carry her. The chandelier world was gone. Whatever came next lived down here, in the dark, where the real negotiations happened. Dawn came in through a window that faced east. Not the Beaumont's chandelier dawn, not the amber and crystal performance of a world that curated its own light. A real one, gray first, then the specific pale gold of a city remembering itself after dark, falling across a room that had exposed brick and a second-hand table and 2 mugs of coffee that Carver had produced from somewhere without being asked. Because Carver understood that some situations required coffee the way others required weapons, and the skill was knowing which. He'd left them alone with it. The new safe house was 3 neighborhoods south of the print shop, a flat above a laundromat, owned through a series of legal architectures that Lyra no longer needed to understand to appreciate. The building breathed with the low mechanical rhythm of the machines below. It was, she thought, the most ordinary sound she had heard in 20 hours, and she found it, unexpectedly, close to comforting. Zen sat across from her at the second-hand table. The dressing at his side was clean. She'd checked it twice and would check it again before the hour was out, the compulsive quality of someone who needed the emergency to stay managed. His color was better than it had been in the print shop. His coffee was untouched. He had the look of a man who had arrived at something he'd been moving toward for a long time and was now taking the measure of it before he spoke. She waited. She had learned, across the length of this impossible night, that Zen's silences were not absences. They were load-bearing. He reached into his jacket, the motion careful now, accommodating the dressing, and produced 2 things, which he set on the table between them with the deliberate placement she recognized from Rennick's poker table, the placement of a considered decision. The first was an envelope. Cream, unsealed, her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside, she could see the edge of it, what appeared to be a travel document. A ticket. The destination folded out of sight. The second was a key. Not the hotel key, not the ceramic sunflower. A door key, simple and unbranded, the kind that opens something permanent. She looked at them both. "The envelope first," Zen said. She picked it up. Removed the contents. A passport, not hers, but correct in every way that mattered. Her face in a photograph she had no memory of being taken. A name she didn't recognize attached to a life that had apparently been constructed with some care. A plane ticket. One way. A city she had thought about once, briefly, years ago, the way people think about places that feel like the shape of something they haven't yet become. He had chosen the city carefully. She understood this without asking. "The storage unit has been secured," Zen said. "Carver handled it 2 hours ago. The schematics are in my possession. Kale Varkas will be managing a significant legal situation before the end of the week, the kind that redirects an organization's entire attention inward." He looked at his untouched coffee. "Your name is not attached to any of it. The contract on you becomes worthless when Kale's world collapses around the thing that generated it. In 72 hours, Lyra Belen is not a name anyone in the Varkas syndicate has operational interest in. And the person in the passport," she said, "has a clean history, a bank account with enough to start, and no connection to anything that happened last night." A pause. "She can be whoever you build her to be." She set the passport down. looked at the plane ticket. The city she'd thought about once, the shape of something she hadn't yet become. Then she looked at the key. And that, she said. Zen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the laundromat's machines turned in their low, even rhythm, and the dawn continued its patient reconstruction of the world beyond the window. And she had the specific sensation of sitting inside a moment that would divide her life into before and after, regardless of which object she reached for. My father built the Cross organization across 30 years, Zen said. He built it on the principle that power without structure is just violence, and structure without loyalty is just machinery. He spent his life trying to make something that was neither. He turned the key once on the tabletop, a single rotation, then left it. When he died, he left me the structure. The loyalty I had to earn separately. A beat. I have spent 8 years learning the difference between the two. She listened. The organization has operations that are not clean, he said, and she appreciated, again, the absence of apology in the admission. I won't tell you otherwise. But there are parts of what I've built that function as something closer to infrastructure, protection for people in the city's underbelly who have no other recourse, supply chains that keep certain communities solvent, information networks that have prevented more violence than they've enabled. He met her eyes. I am not asking you to approve of everything I am. I'm not certain I approve of everything I am. Then what are you asking? He looked at the key. I am asking whether you want to know what's on the other side of that door, he said. Not the organization. Not a role, not a position, not the cross name as a shield. Just whether you want to be in a world where you know the whole map. Where the person sitting across from you at breakfast is the same person who is sitting across from you at the poker table. He paused. Your father asked me to treat you as a person rather than a transaction. I want to tell you that this is not a transaction. The city's dawn was fully arrived now, the gold of it crossing the table between them, catching the edge of the passport, the key, his untouched coffee. She thought about the tolerating smile and how well it had fit. She thought about 9 minutes on a dance floor and the way her knee had rested against his beneath Rennick Vale's table and the hand in the print shop, extended without performance, and him taking it. She thought about her father standing in a parking lot, carrying 23 years of careful, patient love, and spending the last of his energy not on fear, but on logistics, on making sure that when the bill finally came due, his daughter would be standing next to someone with the specific capacity to pay it. Marco Belen, who had grown kitchen gardens and kept his past in a storage unit and circled one name on a list. She looked at the plane ticket for a long time. Then she set it down. She picked up the key. It was lighter than she expected. Keys always were. The weight they carried had nothing to do with their physical mass. It lived entirely in what they opened. And she turned this one in her fingers and felt the specific gravity of a choice that had been made not in this moment, but across the whole length of the night, incrementally, in ballrooms and poker tables and coat closets and print shops. Assembled piece by piece the way her father had assembled his careful documentation, until the total of it was undeniable. I want to see what's on the other side, she said. Zen looked at her across the table in the full morning light, and what lived in his expression was not triumph and not relief and not the cold catalogue she'd first met in the courtyard. It was something quieter and more structural than any of those. The look of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had just, with great care and no ceremony, set half of it down. He reached across the table. Not for the key. For her hand. The same way she had reached for his in the print shop, not performance, not transaction, nothing that required an audience or a cover story. Just true. There are things you'll need to know, he said. People. History. The shape of the map. I learn fast, she said. Difficult rooms. His jaw moved. The ghost of that almost smile, the one she'd been cataloging since the courtyard, and this time it didn't stop at ghost. It arrived. Briefly, completely, and with the quality of something that didn't happen often enough to have lost its significance. Outside, the city ran its machines. The dawn held. And Lyra Belen, who had walked into a gala with a silver tray and walked out with her father's truth and a stranger's key, and something she didn't have a cleaner name for than what it was, drank her coffee and let the morning come. The unfinished business was finished. Everything else was just everything that came next.